1 second here. But things should be pretty good to go now, usually, for the sound to kick in. So again, now we're into part 2 of prokaryotes and viruses, primarily looking at viruses in the second part. The second part will be a little bit shorter. It won't necessarily take quite as long as part 1. And then just again, some reminders to you guys, make sure that tomorrow's a work day, Thursday, you got those 2 optional guided readings that are due. Friday is the quiz, concept questions on Friday, and then Monday, optional chapter 16 guided reading. So that's that. Let's jump right into part 2 and pick up where we left off. So part 2 right now. So we're talking viruses for a little bit. Obviously, a lot with the coronavirus in the news and with the world that we're living in right now. And I think it's kind of poignant that we're talking about viruses right now and a little bit more about what they are, because I think that sitting at home listening to the news and sometimes listening to the press conferences and stuff like that, you don't always maybe get as much about kind of maybe the science behind what these things or what viruses really are. So that's a pretty cool thing that we're kind of clearing up maybe some of those misconceptions today as we finish up part section 8-1 today. So viruses, first and foremost, and again, this is the reason why you don't see them listed anywhere on this sort of tree of life that we're looking at. They're really kind of out here. They're not really a living thing per se, and that's part of that uniqueness is what makes them really so. How do I want to say this? Like resilient. Okay, able to survive and withstand pretty harsh conditions. So couple things to kind of make you realize or understand is that why do they not really classify as being considered living organisms? The fact that they cannot reproduce on their own. And way earlier this year we talked about one of the things that make for a living thing. What makes something living is one of the things that it has to be able to do to be considered living is it has to reproduce on its own. Well, viruses don't do that. Okay. All viruses really have kind of 2 structural components in common. Basically, they are a protein coat, right, that surrounds and houses nucleic acid, either RNA or DNA, or maybe a combination. Okay. So basically, I want you to kind of think of them as DNA that is surrounded by a protein. And viruses really act in a sense as DNA injectors, DNA or RNA injectors. Their job is to basically get their sequences of genetic information into other cells so those cells can do the reproducing for them. Some viruses will also produce their own enzymes as well too. Okay, we've learned about what enzymes are. Enzymes are a type of biological compound or molecule that helps push reactions, right? Or they help to break things down. So viruses will often secrete or build their own enzymes that will a lot of times allow them to be able to break down cell membranes or cell walls to allow them to again inject their nucleic acid into cells, right? That is their primary function is trying to find a way for them to be able to reproduce and create more copies of themselves. And as partly that reason that viruses are sort of really looked at and sought after as very unique too. Obviously, viruses can have harm and can cause sickness and illness, but it's also in terms of changes in medical research, using viruses to actually inject DNA into cells and deliver different either gene therapies or to deliver actually drugs or compounds. Um, so viruses, the machinery behind what viruses are can have been found to be even used in some pretty interesting and beneficial medical applications. Because they are this almost like, in a sense, almost like you think of them as a robot. They are a protein coat housing nucleic acid, and their job is to inject that information into other cells. Viruses have some pretty funky shapes. They can be uh, really alien-like, is a way that, kind of a way that I think of it. Really some funky looking shapes. So these are just some examples. And again, I'm not expecting you to sit here and memorize these, but as we have these different, what are called sort of mosaic viruses, that is sort of RNA looped around sort of a central axis. These adenoviruses, which have this almost like geometric shape. Influenza viruses are these sort of spherical shape. You've got this membranous envelope of protein coat, glycoprotein or protein coat, and there's some RNAs that it's ready to inject. And then these things called bacteriophages. It's almost like, think of them like a hypodermic needle, right? They have or hold DNA within sort of this head region. They attach to cells, and then they are going to inject that genetic information into the cells that they are attacking or attaching to. Now, for what purpose, right? Again, the purpose of it is in order for these to survive and to be able to duplicate, copy, and exist. They need to, again, find host cells to allow for new copies of the virus to be able to assemble. So viruses have a life cycle, right? There's many variations, but generally speaking, there are 4 stages to a viral cycle. Invade the host cell. So exposure to a virus, ultimately that virus finds a way to invade a host cell or host cells. And it injects that DNA or material into the host cell. And it uses the host cell's machinery to copy viral DNA or RNA and to synthesize these different viral proteins that can ultimately be harmful to the cells that are around or surround it. It uses the cell's ability to copy and produce more DNA and more genetic material, and to be able to then create more copies of the virus. Okay? So they assemble new viruses inside the host cell, and then these viruses may exit the host cell and ultimately lyse and the DNA may become completely inserted into and become a part of the host cell. So lyse is kind of a fancy term for that DNA to be inserted into the host cell, and that DNA sequence that has been injected by the virus becomes a part of the genetic code of that host cell. Okay. So just to kind of give you an idea, and so you guys know, the coronavirus is sort of a virus that I think, from what I understand and what I've read, is sort of on the sort of same sequence in a sense as that of influenza, this sort of same basic shape. Okay. And it works kind of on the same premise, or works on a very similar life cycle to what we're seeing here. So the virus, it attaches to a cell, and it ultimately has some nucleic acid, either DNA or RNA, that ends up penetrating, and the virus penetrates and injects its material into that host cell. Now, this viral nucleic acid replicates using the host cell's machinery, and now new copies of that virus end up bursting out of that host cell to go on and to infect other cells, right? So the cell is almost sort of unknowingly, the genetic code that is injected into it is unknowingly causing it to create more copies of this, what ultimately becomes a very harmful, right, sort of end to this life cycle. Okay. But the virus is using the mechanics or the cell division and machinery that exists within cells to duplicate and create proteins, to duplicate and create new membrane, and ultimately, in this case, viruses. Okay. So viruses, again, they cause disease by destroying cells, okay, which we kind of just saw in this, the end result in many viral life cycles. Or they disrupt cellular processes. If the virus is inserted into and becomes a part of the host cell's genetic material, that certainly, it's like putting, some extraneous sentence into a paragraph. It doesn't necessarily fit. It doesn't necessarily make sense, and then it is going to throw off those genes or information for ultimately healthy proteins or healthy processes that those proteins support. Many viruses can lay dormant for a long period of time before they can become active. Okay. And they can spread throughout the body during this dormancy period. So HIV is human immunodeficiency virus, and HIV is what causes AIDS, okay, which is the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So HIV is a virus that can lay dormant and can be treated for extensive periods of time. But eventually, if it becomes a full-blown virus, it can end up becoming detrimental and fatal. And you hear about this like with the coronavirus. You hear about people that are potentially asymptomatic. And what does that mean? It means that they are infected with the virus. They've become exposed to the virus, but it is laying dormant, or they have a certain level of potential immunity that allows them to not necessarily have as much harm or any harm at all. And those that have this dormancy or that are asymptomatic can still spread the virus without really even knowing it. And this is why there's such a push right now to testing to figure out who has and who doesn't have, in order to be able to sort of understand how we're going to be able to work with minimizing the result of what the coronavirus can do. Okay. And it's because of this that the fact that viruses really aren't a living thing and they use other cells, they're actually very difficult to fight. We can't use antibiotics to treat them. Really in sort of the normal sequence is it boils down to hygiene. It's washing hands, it's cleaning surfaces, they're frequently used, it's covering your coughs and sneezes, all these things that basic hygiene and that are going to help to fight or combat the spread of these viruses. Okay. We have our own natural defenses against viruses within our immune system, particularly white blood cells and other components of our immune systems. There are some drugs that are used to disrupt viral reproduction. So, but these antiviral drugs are certainly not necessarily as effective as antibiotics, because again, a lot of times they can also have some pretty far-reaching side effects outside of actually treating the virus. So these compounds can play a role in harming other cells or other tissues. But one of the big things that really is effective in treating viruses are vaccines. Okay, and obviously with the coronavirus right now, there is no vaccine. They're working on a vaccine for it that they think will be done within like a year or so. But these vaccines, how do they kind of work? That's an interesting story too. So vaccines are basically kind of think of them as you're not truly being injected with the virus itself, but you're being injected with like a destroyed form of it, in a sense. Okay? Our bodies are responsible, and our immune system loaded with white blood cells and different components of our immune system that are responsible for recognizing foreign invaders. Okay, and when our body recognizes these foreign invaders, it will trigger these immune responses that will fight off viruses. Right? If you ever things like the common cold, and you go to the doctor and you feel really sick, and they said, well, you got a virus, right? And they say, it's just go home and rest, drink plenty of fluids, and you should be good in a few days, right? Obviously, like with the coronavirus, the symptoms are much more amplified than maybe a typical, obviously, than a typical common cold. But our body's immune system has to respond to that. Well, vaccines basically, it tricks our immune system. So when we get vaccinated in these vaccine injections, it causes our bodies to have the ability to recognize and respond to these invading viruses. So that way, if there is a future exposure to it, our immune system already has a resistance to it. Okay, so vaccines are really, again, like I said, it's kind of like this. It's like you think about like you shooting a gun and firing blanks in a sense. You've removed the bullets from that gun in a sense, and that now that vaccine is still recognizable to our immune system, and it triggers an immune response that allows for if we have future exposures. So vaccinations are, so these are different viral infections. And again, it's not about necessarily, memorizing these, but, a lot of these different, we got influenza, we have different flu vaccines every year. The flu virus is a type of virus that will mutate quite a bit. We have, let's see, where's some other, so hepatitis affects like the liver, and there are different, what we call it, vaccines that are used for hepatitis. Smallpox, right? Measles, rubella, okay? The MMR shot, the measles, mumps, and rubella shot. These are all viruses that, used to be incredibly, they're incredibly contagious, they're incredibly harmful. Can be incredibly fatal with that of really, especially with like the very young kids. So there's mumps is another one. Okay. So measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR shot that you guys get as kids, are vaccinations, right? That are used to be able to trick our body into an immune response without ever having really been exposed to them. And what it's done is things like smallpox and rubella and measles and mumps and things like that have been virtually eliminated. Another thing like polio, right? So polio is a viral infection that and was on to the level of, in a sense, almost to the level of pandemic that we're experiencing right now, until a scientist by the name of Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine. And vaccinations then were saved hundreds of thousands to millions and millions of lives from a debilitating and often deadly and crippling disease or deadly viral infection. So there's lots of different kind of viruses, right? And sometimes our bodies are able to respond to them, and sometimes we also have the help of being able to use science to develop vaccines to fight them off. Like we said a couple minutes ago, the flu virus, right? There's different flu viruses every year. They change it up a little bit because influenza is a virus that mutates quite a bit, okay? And that's kind of, again, sort of one of the fears. The coronavirus right now it's called the novel coronavirus. Novel means unique. There are other coronaviruses out there. There are other viruses out there that are similar to this, but it is novel and unique that there has not been any sort of vaccine developed until science can use and be able to discover what structures are there to be able to develop a vaccine. So we'll have some more discussion about vaccinations and a little bit more about, antivirals and vaccinations and a little bit about this ultimately in our team meetings this week as well. That should be it. Thanks, guys. And that is it for prokaryotes and viruses. Quiz on this, ultimately information, is not until Friday. So you got some time to kind of digest this and talk with me about it if needed. And we'll see you guys in the team meeting ultimately on Thursday. Okay. All right. See ya.